Precious.
Oh, yeah.
I'm straight out of work.
Straight from work. Oh, and that's all you have is
No, that's not
cheese
all,
crackers?
that's not all I have. I had plenty of snacks at work also,
Okay,
but I haven't
okay.
had an actual
And
dinner.
it's-
It's on a delay. So,
Yeah, I don't know if Jean is even
How are
coming
you
tonight.
today?
hey, doing great. How are you?
Living the dream.
Excellent.
Work at
I
six
think there's a
AM.
seat here too.
Okay, thanks.
Kind of a long dream.
Yeah.
Jean's not coming? I can take her name tag.
I don't know.
Okay,
Didn't talk to her today.
okay. Audio's good.
I'll take it
Hi.
if she doesn't come.
Hello. Hi.
I muted my microphone. I didn't know if that was.
Yeah, because we got speakers overhead, so you, perfect.
So we're all set?
Yeah, we're all set.
And then just end the Zoom meeting
Yeah,
when
just
we're
use
done.
Zoom. You have the controls now, so you
Okay.
can,
Mess it up.
you can, yeah, do with it if you like. I wanted, thanks, Alma. We need to do.
No, I
Okay.
don't think we need
Okay.
attendance.
I did want to mention something real quick for the next minutes, just so you guys are aware, because we had that question about the absences for last time. Our system cannot not display alternates, like if they were sitting in the audience. So it shouldn't have been recorded as an absence, so I did take that off of the minutes, just so you all are aware. But the regular attending members on the dais will show up on there. That's just how the Legistar shows that, and alternates won't be viewed at all in that, just so you guys are aware for future sake. But I think
It was.
Commissioner Sanchez brought that to our
Yeah,
attention.
I was gonna say it was David who
Yes,
asked, so
yeah,
he shows
so
up all.
I just wanted to make you guys aware of that, so. Cool. Well, then,
Can we expect everybody, well, there's Deborah, yeah. Right
we
on
got
time.
3 more minutes. Did you all have any problems getting in? The
No,
front?
the
Good.
door, the door was unlocked.
Okay, good. We have somebody we contract that's supposed to do that remotely, so good to hear.
Hi.
Hi,
Well, last time when it was locked, the police just let us in
Yeah.
anyway.
hello.
They're
Hi
like,
there.
we have a gun, we'll let you in. And apparently, this didn't scare them, so.
Cool, Ryan's gonna be here and. Yeah, I think David's gonna be here though. Did anybody want any snacks?
I got my Ritz already.
Okay. I remember having water. That was it.
The world's tiniest water.
Last night I was feeling a
You
little
were
dry
parched.
throat.
Yeah.
Cheers.
After
Oh,
2
I don't
hours.
know how to adjust.
Right, I'll leave.
Thanks, Andrew.
It's over
Appreciate
here.
it so much.
Too many adjustments. Maybe I'll do this. Yeah, there you go. Instead of trying to adjust it, I'll just steal one that goes right. My feet weren't even on the floor. Now David's gonna come and have the same issue.
Yeah, I just feel adjusting.
Hello, David.
What's my issue?
I said, I
Oh, your
just
chair
switched
is
this
raised
chair. With this one, you might have to do, it's so tall, my feet weren't touching the floor. So,
Wow.
and I don't know how to adjust
Like
them.
way taller than you.
Yeah, I know, so, but then again, it also might smash you up against the tabletop.
That was my weight.
Okay, good, you got it under control.
I think we're gonna be okay. Oh, look, that's the first thing.
Yeah, there's you.
The city council joining this.
No, they did this last night, I
Oh,
watched.
okay.
Oh, did you watch city council?
Watched.
That was good. You got to hear their dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and a lot of it, I was like, well, I understand that, but I think I understood. Long story short,
You
I un-
understood what was being presented?
yeah, and I understood that their questions, which I thought sometimes were because they didn't understand what was being
Yeah.
presented. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I was sitting there explaining it to my monitor, like, wait, 2 different things,
Right.
apples, oranges,
Mhm.
apples. How are you?
You can sit over here. I don't think Jean's coming. We're gonna give it a minute because we think Ryan's coming. Does everybody know Jeff Brazel, our Community Development Director?
Nice.
We've met
Everyone, yes.
before.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Can't say I know
But you
him.
know of him?
That's probably a better thing.
He's been in a lot of meetings at the same time.
Yep,
I've seen him around.
And our consultant, Brian Mambry with Kendon Keast Collaborative is going to be presenting to you tonight.
Yeah.
Yes. And who is this? Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries. My name is Sung. This is actually my second day, but I'm the new principal planner focused on long range planning for the city. So-
Oh, well, good. Then we keep you around for a while. So it's
Yes.
good to now know who you are. So. Are you a Colorado native?
Kind of. I immigrated from South Korea when I was like 5 or 6, so kind of.
Well, yeah, you don't have much of an accent, so yeah, 5 or 6 kind of
Not
knocked it right out. But you've been here since 5 or 6, that counts.
Yeah.
You grew up, your
Yeah.
formative
My
years.
English is way better than my Korean.
Mine too.
I just don't like that, but, yeah. So.
Yes.
Well, I guess we can get started. I don't know if Ryan's coming or not tonight. So tonight, we're talking about the Land Development Code, which last time you were here, we presented on the existing Land Development Code to kind of give you a grounding of what does the code do. Basically, what the update to the Land Development Code is focused on is modernizing the code and implementing the comprehensive plan. It also, so the LDC establishes the rules that govern what people can do with their property and how they can develop their property. So Brian is here with Kendon Keast tonight to present to you all 4 modules. The modules are broken down by Module 1, which is generally the zone districts and use standards. Module 2 is the design standards. Module 3 is subdivision standards. And then Module 4 is the review bodies and review procedures. We'd like your feedback tonight on 3 different things and we asked council the same question. These are proposed changes to the code. The use by permits are changing to limited use permits. And limited use permits are a subset of permitted uses that are subject to specific design and operational standards. And it's proposed that those would be administrative instead of what now use by permits go to Board of Adjustment. Those are in contrast to conditional use permits, which may have impacts to adjacent properties that have to be mitigated. And those require hearing by Planning Commission and City Council. Hi, Jean. We do have your name tag over there. Sorry, you grabbed it late.
Hasn't shown up at this point.
Yeah, Ryan hasn't shown up, so
Make yourself
he may not be.
available and just slide down a little if he shows up. Okay.
So the other thing that we'd like to get your feedback on is the preliminary plat. And this is a new development application type that doesn't exist in Commerce City, but it's quite frequently used in other communities. The preliminary plat outlines the lots, the blocks, the streets, the open spaces. And it's done when you still have preliminary engineering to determine compliance with standards and compatibility with design. This would be an exchange for City Council having the option of calling up final plats. So that puts developers at a significant risk because when you do a final plat, you have to do your final engineering design, which is quite costly. And so the risk of having City Council call it up to potentially deny your final plat is something that the development community would rather not have happen. And so they're excited about this concept of preliminary plat to do this to go to Planning Commission and City Council at an earlier stage in the design before they have a full-blown final plat. And then the last thing that's a change from the current code or a significant change is the concept of the master development plan. So this is a new application type as well, for larger development projects, phase developments, or mixed-use developments. In a residential context, you would show how different filings of that subdivision coordinate together. In a mixed use, you'd show the layouts of
There he
the
is.
streets, the blocks, and the land uses. Hey, Ryan.
Fun to see.
You can sit here. So those are the three things that we'd like to have your specific feedback on. The master development plan would go to planning commission and city council. And Brian is gonna go ahead and present to you this evening on those 4 modules. He's gonna pause at the end of each module so that we can answer questions that you have. Okay? Hey, Ryan, glad to have you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Heather. Again, I'm Brian Mabry. I'm with Pindicky's Collaborative. We're the firm that the city hired to work on the land development code update. And so I'm happy to be here. This is a rather lengthy presentation. I'll be upfront about it, and there's kind of a lot to swallow. So, again, if I forget to pause, please stop me after each module, and I'll do that. But there's a lot of content. So to start off, the city adopted a comprehensive plan not too long ago, and sometimes there's confusion among some folks, especially more kind of lay persons, not so much planning commissions, but what the difference is between a comprehensive plan and a land development code. And one way to think of it is sort of like the difference between a menu and a recipe, or a menu and a cookbook, or something of that nature. So comprehensive plan is a set of policies for that sort of describe how the city could grow in the future. It's kind of visionary, has a lot of images and graphics, and kind of sets the stage for how the city could grow, just like the menu is, it doesn't get into how things are made or what goes into them that much. There might be some descriptions, but it's just the price and what it is and some images. So that's sort of, can kind of think of a comprehensive plan being like the menu. And a land development code, though, is more like the cookbook of how the things on the menu are made. A land development code has standards in it that relate to various development of private property, like parking or signs or land uses, or street patterns, processes. And that's sort of the land development code is a legal document that has legal bearing. Whereas a comprehensive plan is a policy document that is not a legal document. So the land development code has images in it, has pictures, but they're not often as kind of photographically related and aspirational like you might find in a comprehensive plan. The land development code graphics are more like more technical drawings that show where a building needs to be on a property, how tall it can be, what kind of how many plants or trees compose a buffer, things like that, as opposed to, again, the more aspirational pictures in a plan. So that sort of is one way to think of the difference between those two documents. So what does a land development code include? A lot of different things. It's sort of a one-stop document for most things you want to know when you're developing a site. There are other things that that it doesn't show that I'll have in a later slide, but so zoning and land use, what kinds of land uses are allowed in what zoning districts, along with a zoning map that also goes along with the land development code. How land can be subdivided, so lots and blocks and easement widths, sidewalk widths, street connections, street widths, right-of-way widths, all those things go along in the subdivision standards portion. How a building is designed, like the exterior of the building, what kinds of features it has to have, what kind of design elements the building has to have, as well as other parts of site design, parking and landscaping, signs, and things like that. Then sort of switching gears on what a land development code includes, there are development review bodies and review procedures that are established in it, or that are at least referenced. So the city council is established in the charter and in the municipal code. So the land development code doesn't formally establish them. And I think all of your review bodies are established in at least one, if not both of those documents. So it's more like kind of references and gives, some basic rules of procedure, like for the Board of Adjustment, any kind of quorum rules that are sort of special to those groups, or voting, whether super majorities are required in some instances or not. And then the procedures as well. So the steps that are needed to obtain a rezoning or variance or development plan approval or subdivision approval, all of those things are covered in a particular couple of chapters in the Land Development Code. Also nonconformities. So whether it's buildings or land uses or lots or things like that were established at one time on a site and were within the rules of that were in place at the time when it was established. But, over time, rules change, and today those that land use or that lot might not meet up with the current standards in the Land Development Code. So how you handle nonconformities and the kind of parameters or restrictions that are put on them. A house or a business isn't forced to go out of business when the rules change. They can continue to operate. It's just that there are limitations on their expansions that frequently can't happen. How the LDC is enforced and what constitutes penalties and violations are included. And then finally, definitions of various technical terms are part of a land development code. So that's what a land development includes or provides. Here are a few things that a land development code doesn't provide or doesn't include. So it's not a property tax document. It doesn't set property tax rates for any property within the city or assess any particular property of its taxable value. It's not a capital improvements program or a capital improvements plan, which is a budget and a schedule for improving infrastructure, like extending utilities or widening streets, things of that nature. It's not the building code. It does, as I said earlier, have to do with how the exterior of the building is designed. Excuse me, but it doesn't relate to how many bathrooms a building has to have or what its HVAC is like or things like that. And then finally, it's not construction standards. That is more to do with something that like the city engineer would administer related to like manhole spacing and design and curb and gutter design, what kind of layers go into making a street and all of that. And there's a lot of other things that it's not, but these are the most common ones that might be sort of misconceptions about what a land development code can control. There's a lot of goals for this project that have been kind of established from the start. Modernizing the LDC into a 2025 document instead of, I don't know when it was last overhauled, but probably, 10 or so years ago. And there's a lot that's changed in zoning since then. So we want to have a LDC that is with the times. Implementing the policies of the comprehensive plan so that, as I said before, you've got a cookbook to make the items that are on the menu. Organizing and reorganizing the contents of the code so that it's in a more contemporary best practice sort of arrangement with the contents. Tailoring the standards to achieve quality and resilient outcomes. That's sort of, based on the policies of the comprehensive plan. But this firm I work for has been in business over 40 years, and we've, picked up some things in other communities that we find to be kind of best practices. And so we bring those, as kind of a toolkit to the codes of streamlining is a big one. Trying to, where we can, where you all and where the council feels comfortable, delegating certain kinds of approvals to staff, as Heather mentioned earlier, with some of the procedures she mentioned. Recurring theme with those is to have staff approval or denial in some cases, of course, rather than going all the way up to city council. That has several benefits, one of which is certainty and predictability for an applicant. If they submit a sign permit, then they can have some confidence that what they've provided, if they've met all the rules, is gonna very likely get approved. There's some things that will never go to staff for approval, like a rezoning or a conditional use permit or a variance. Those are still gonna stay as they are, with, approval by the right elected or appointed group of people. But there are things that can be worked in, like certain kinds of adjustments that can, if they're minor enough, can have staff approval and not require a formal variance process. And can save, a lot of at least perceived, red tape on the part of the applicant when it's very likely to get approved, but the applicant doesn't know that. And so we are advocates of more administrative approval where we can. And just creating a user-friendly development code with as much graphics and tables as possible. Heather already went through the contents of the modules of the code, so I won't reiterate those, but there were 4 modules. And number 4 is new material to you all, but at some point, either you or your predecessors heard the contents of the other 3 modules. So module 1. First article is easy, not a whole lot of details for it, and that's very normal. Just some cleanup and adding a few technical provisions related to severability, which means if there were a lawsuit on a certain paragraph of the land development code, and that paragraph were declared to be illegal or unconstitutional or something like that, then that doesn't torpedo the whole code. It's just that one piece that goes away. But you have to say that in a legal document like this, that it's just the thing that's declared illegal that gets flushed and not the entire document. There will be an effective date for this LDC, and that's going to be more of a city council decision. But after adoption, it's usually either very quickly after the thing is adopted, or there's sometimes a leeway period depending on this situation. So Article 2, there are significant parts to Article 2 and most of the rest of the articles. Reconfiguring and reworking the zoning districts based off the character areas of the comprehensive plan. So, or character districts, I believe you call them. Character districts are not zoning districts. Those are, some plans used to call them future land use districts, but it's a little more on trend to call them character districts or character areas. They're sort of recommendations for how the areas could be zoned in the future. But they're not, the character area map in the comprehensive plan is not the zoning map. The zoning map is, again, a legal document that has kind of hard and fast boundaries of the different zoning districts, while the character areas in the comprehensive plan are not as hard and fast. There's a reworked land use matrix or land use table within the Article 2, as well as development standards for each zoning district. And by development standards, I mean setbacks and building heights and densities and FARs and floor area ratios in some cases. And there's also a newer concept known as building types, where there are certain, whether it's single family detached, single family attached, or duplex, or multiplex, which is a quad or a triplex, and other types of buildings are set out and established. And then there are standards later on in the code that relate to those different types of buildings. You all probably would be able to get this PowerPoint if you requested it from staff, I would assume. And so this might not be as easy to read as we would like, but this is an excerpt from the Land Development Code showing kind of the interaction of the character districts on the left from the comprehensive plan and how they relate to the what are called the former zoning districts, but really they're your current zoning districts, and how those relate again to the districts that are proposed. And then there's a cross-reference in that final column to the actual more detailed standards for those different districts. So this can be helpful. It's helpful to kind of, and I don't believe your current code does this, but it relates the districts to the character areas so that if a person comes along and is applying for and requesting a rezoning for like R2, which we've carried over much of the naming conventions from your current code to this one. If someone comes and wants to apply for the R2 zoning district, then there's that central neighborhood in the draft is sort of the appropriate future land or the appropriate character district for that zoning district. And this table shows that and shows how they relate to each other.
Could you explain that? I somehow got lost in that process.
Yeah, so the character map in the comprehensive plan has the city broken down into various character districts that aren't zoning districts, but they're sort of recommendations for future zoning. There are certain districts in the LDC that are tied to those character areas, and that's what this table is showing. So like another example might be Fusion there on the right is one of the more industrial style of character districts. The zoning district that is tied to that character district is I2, medium intensity industrial. So if a person had a property within the Fusion character area and they came forward and were wanting to do a rezoning to like R1, to like a residential district, that's over there and related to those other character districts. And it's not gonna probably get very far. It probably wouldn't even be recommended, to submit it because it has a very low chance of being approved. Because it's not tied into that particular instance that I was just describing of the Fusion character district. So, yeah, it's a guide. I mean, I don't know if you can absolutely prevent someone from trying for that, but it would be kind of probably not too smart to do that, a waste of money and time probably. And I'm definitely not going to read through all of these purpose statements, but this is just to show you that there are all the zoning districts have purpose statements that kind of set the stage for what that district is trying to accomplish or what its character is. So just as an example, R1, a very common district, this zoning district provides for the protection of established single-family detached neighborhoods and low-density residential developments. So, kind of what you would expect of a single-family district. But there are other districts that are more oriented towards other kinds of housing types or building types, like the residential village. The district provides for flexibility yet certainty by allowing varying lot areas and all different housing types with a maximum density and open space standards. So it's a tool for sort of shorthand for when someone is requesting, a certain district. You could glance at your handy copy of the land development code and see, okay, this is what sort of the general gist of that district is that these people have come, before the planning commission to ask for. There's another slide with more purpose statements. And again, if you end up having a copy of this PowerPoint, you'd be able to look through those at your leisure. More excerpts from the land development code with the various districts. Each of these districts on the left were shown in the previous slides with their purpose statements, but this table gives each district and a little sketch of what the character of that district would sort of look like ideally if it were built out. There are larger versions of those sketches in other parts of the land development code, so they're not shrunk down like that. Each district has what we call development options within it, or not, maybe not. Yeah, I guess each one does. And there are within a district a few different development options for each one. So an example there, the second sort of major row is RE or residential estate. Within that, there are three different sort of development options that an applicant could pursue. And they have different densities and corresponding different open space amounts that are required. And by open space, I mean the amount of either just kind of amenities like park or natural area or greenery, greenways, trails, those kind of amenities that are not on a site by site spaces are a lot by lot, but are shared by the entire development. So just to go along with that sample a little bit, the RE district, the rural residential, the three different densities that are allowed within that district are, which I apologize, you probably can't see it too well, but 0.85 units per acre, so less than one house per acre, 1.25 per acre, and then 2 units per acre. So they get a little denser with each of the three development options, but to counteract that additional density, there's more open space that's required in the development to offset the more dense development that would come along with going for that third option there within RE that allows for 2 units per acre. Yes, it's 2 units per acre, but you also have to, the applicant also has to provide 40% of the site as of the development as open space or some other similar kind of amenity to offset that additional density that they're getting. So that happens throughout the different districts, and that's something our firm sort of kind of hangs our hat on, and we found it to be workable in many places. On the right is another table showing the different housing types. So these are residential, so there's single family, detached, single family attached, modular home, townhouse, multiplex apartment, and cottage court. With again, the little sketches that go with each one showing which districts those housing types or building types are allowed within. The districts make up the columns in that particular table. Then there's a cross-reference to standards for those different building types.
In the cottage court, I'm sorry, what are it looks like the circles are half filled on the far right side though, is that, have I seen that correctly? I just can't tell.
The cottage court, what was the question? I'm sorry.
Well, the last two,
Oh, yes, the half-filled circle means that it's permitted, it's sort of a cluster style development where the houses are sort of closer together as opposed to not as much a cluster style with the solid dots.
That actually confused me more.
Okay.
Yeah, because so what makes something a solid dot and one is a dot that is only filled in on the left-hand side, and the right side of that dot as far as it is only a partial
I
dot.
feel like maybe some people haven't noticed there's a key at the top.
Yeah, that's what I mean, and I can't read the key. So
Okay.
what is the key? I think
Yeah,
is-
so
clusters.
yeah, the solid dot is, think of it as sort of permitted
Okay.
by right. And by right means there's standards that go along with it, but for the half circle, the permitted and clusters, there are additional standards that go along with that particular housing type in that particular district.
So if they wanted to put that, maybe 3 different developers would choose a similar area or something? That's what permitted in clusters, or?
It's more, you could, I don't know, we might have to relook if the filled in or the half dots are that essential. We might simplify it by having the solid dots. It's just to say that that's sort of a cluster style, a style of development that has the houses sort of bunched around a common open area.
So we'll keep all of the people who live in a cottage community in the same area. Same geographic area.
It's more meant, probably should relook at, again, having just solid dots there, but it's signifying that is there's a common, I mean, you can't see the image too well, but there's a common open area in the middle and the houses are around it, sort of in a cluster around that open space that's there in the middle. Yes.
Just a higher level question related to this discussion. And you, I'm sure, will discuss this in a subsequent section. Will there be a definitions section that would outline? So if we had a question about what clusters actually are, that it would specify this is what clusters are.
Well, there's standards related to it, but and also there's definitions. Yes, we wouldn't just leave it. Yeah, right. We wouldn't just leave it unsaid, or if we did, we'd want to correct that and fill in the blank that's there. But there's definitely very lengthy definitions in the back and standards that elaborate on many of these things that we're hitting at a higher level.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So
Because the
would
word
that,
cluster is what I am not understanding.
would that be like the houses that are around and they all share a common driveway?
Yes. That's.
Or
No.
common green,
Yeah, green.
There's a different building type for the
we
driveway.
have a thing called a
Oh.
motor court that,
Yeah.
and actually this table is longer than that. You know, I fit in what I could. There's probably a few more rows. There's a one called a motor court. And maybe one or two other ones that make up that table.
You see a lot of these over in Central Park where they're around a private little green, like they share the front yard basically.
And is that a cluster, or do you need three of them sharing three front to be a cluster? That's where I was getting with, could you have one greenway and the homes around it? That means this is a cluster. Or do you have to have two different sets of 5 homes with a greenway
You have
of
to
their
have
own?
multiple clusters to be a cluster.
Exactly. Sets. It would be sets. Where does the cluster come from? So you have a set of home and a greenway, and then you have 2 sets of homes and a greenway to constitute a cluster.
More
So
the
that's-
first scenario
Okay,
that you
then,
described.
then that's good. That makes sense to me.
Higher level, just a curiosity, does it specify the open space requirements? Because it seems to me there's a spirit of the law and then the actual regulations.
Yeah.
In the sense that I've seen filings come through where the people's that have a like the condos, whatever, they say the backyard is now a common space because the person doesn't have it. So they're finding any way to shove common space in where, but it's not really the spirit of what you're trying to do.
Right. It would have to be usable and there's rules about that. And in a couple slides, I'll have some amenity and open space content. But yeah, it wouldn't be just any ground could count as open space. There's some standards that go along with it.
Like minimum dimensionalities,
Mhm.
location.
Access or whatnot.
Sorry,
Accessibility.
there should be, yes, yes.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
One additional question just to definitions, because I'm familiar with this with model codes.
Mhm.
Is there a default to where the definition of a word, if it's not specified in the definitions, that it's like Merriam-Webster's dictionary, or is there language related to
yeah.
that?
I don't know if this draft has it, but it's very common for us to say, we usually don't cite a specific dictionary, but we would say words that aren't defined have their common meaning. Like an acre, we don't define an acre because that's a universal thing, at least in the United States. So, yeah, we usually don't cite a specific dictionary.
Just as long as there's language as to what, if it wasn't outlined in the definitions, that there was a common.
We say like have their common meaning, yes.
Thank you.
These are just meant to give you a visual. They're again excerpts of 2 different sort of sheets, or one, if you were to print out, you know, if the code were adopted and you printed it out, gives some a visual of a couple of the districts. One is the residential village and the other is the single family detached. And remember the development options I mentioned earlier within each of the districts gives a visual for those, gives some real kind of basic information and then some references down at the bottom in the table at the bottom of each of those pages that direct the reader to other parts of the LDC that apply, just so it doesn't seem like, you know, that they're lacking information. So there's information about land use and building type and other kinds of references there in the table on each of those pages. And when this is adopted, it will be like clickable, basically. It will be it'll be able to be converted to a PDF if someone wants to use it that way, but its native format is as a website. And so it will have features that will be user-friendly, like clickable links or hovering over certain words, and the definition will pop up if it's defined in the back of the document. So here are the non-residential and mixed-use districts with similar information as I showed on the residential ones. Lot areas, amenity space or open space. Some of these non-residential districts, like the mixed-use MU1 district, have residential permissions within them. So there is a density column there that comes into play for that district. Others have floor area ratios or FAR numbers, which are a control or a way to control the bulk of the building on a site, aside from just building height and setbacks. And then there again are standards in the right column that point to each of the kind of individual district pages like I showed before. So then there are commercial building types as well, and those are laid out in the table and shown in what districts they're allowed in. Live work, which is sort of like mixed use, but it's more like for maker space kind of land uses. And by that, I mean lighter, like extremely light manufacturing, like candle maker or, you know, some kind of typically like more artisan style activities like that. So, you know, you wouldn't want a whole huge soap factory next door, but someone, you know, might not mind as much having like a live workspace next door that's got a small scale, you know, maker activities like that going on. Live work, mixed use, commercial, office institutional, light industrial, heavy industrial, and parking structure are the non-residential building types. And again, there are standards there on the right that point to or a cross-reference in each of the rows in the column on the right that then would take you to standards related to those building types. Here is a zoom in on a particular building type. Like if you were to click one of those references on the right on the previous slide, then you'd come to a conceptual illustration of what that building you know, consists of. The written information there at the bottom is more like a description in words of that type of building. Then there are rules related to setbacks and building coverage, parking location, building heights. Some of these buildings, this came up last night when a council member was concerned about bulk. Some of these buildings have what are called step back requirements where they can be like 2 stories at the, you know, if they're abutting the sidewalk, they can be 2 stories at the sidewalk. But if they want to be taller, they have to then go back and then they can be taller farther back. So that's not quite as an imposing of a building, you know, right at the sidewalk where, you know, pedestrians would be or that type of thing. So it's another way, kind of like floor area ratio, to control the bulk of the building or the perceived, you know, bulk of the building at street level. So as I mentioned, there's a slide on open and amenity space. So, and this little image up there is in the way, but I don't think I can move that. Let me see if I can.
It says 515 and let's see, 515, 25. Yeah,
Well-
515 and 25
What do you mean?
Percentages.
percentages. The
Oh,
open space
okay.
percentage.
I thought you meant had something to do with the image.
Oh, no.
Okay, yeah, behind the image there is a 5%, what was it, 15?
Yeah, 5% for auto urban residential, 15%
15%
for
and
urban residential, and 25% for urban core.
Yeah, so that is the amount of amenity space required for those 3 developments. And what we mean by amenity space gets spelled out in words and images in Article 2 here. So it's not just like parkland or preserved natural area. There's other options beside that might not fit well within a more urbanized context. So there are plazas as an open or an amenity space type. Some other ones are community gardens, like community facilities, like there in the very bottom of the 3rd image. And again, I know it's small, but is a community facility photo that happens to be a pool. There are other ones in there, greenways or trails. They're all allowed in the different districts. Some districts allow all of them. Some districts that are meant to be more urbanized kind of focus on the plazas and the courtyards and those kind of things that are more urban in character. But those are the ways that a development can bring in the amenity space by, if it's more of a suburban style, then yeah, it would make sense probably to have either parkland or natural open area. And so they're sort of there in each of the, allowed in each of the districts to different extents. And the point is to mitigate or to offset, you know, the extra density that some of the development options within a district, you know, allows. As you can see up there, one of the third development option here allows 14 units per acre, and it requires a 25% open and amenity space. The one above it is less dense. It's like 7.5 or so, and it's the one that had the 15% open space. So the more open space they give, the more that an applicant gives, the more density they will get, and therefore the more, you know, units they can sell or lots they can sell, as the case may be. So Article 3 is the final article of the first module, and then we'll stop and see if there's other questions or comments. Article 3 use standards has what we call use categories, and there's several different use categories. The one that's inserted on the screen here is the outdoor recreation use category. It's got all kinds of things in it: amphitheater, amusement or water park, country club, drive-in theater, racetrack, all kinds of land uses listed out there that make up, that describe what makes up the outdoor recreation use category. There's also in the middle column there all of the different accessory uses that would be associated with uses in the outdoor recreation use category. And that's like classrooms, docks, minor utilities, night watchman's quarters, just to pick a few off of there. Then the third column is uses that you might think would have belonged in that use category, but actually belong somewhere else. So there's like an entire other use category called indoor recreation. That would be like movie theaters or what's some other ones?
Bowling alley.
Bowling alley, yeah, pool hall, those kind of things. Those are actually, you know, those aren't outdoor recreation. Those are over in the indoor recreation use category. So the reason we do this is will be a little more clear probably on the second slide. It helps to shorten the use table. Use tables can be very lengthy and have all the different land uses, and each one have a P or an L or a dash or a C. But this is a tool. Use categories are a tool to help shorten the use table. So continuing with that outdoor recreation example, on the left is the use table, and that's the table that shows what land uses are allowed in rows compared to the zoning districts that are in columns there at the top. Outdoor recreation just takes up one row because we treat them all the same because their land use impacts are really very similar to one another. And so if someone wanted to see, okay, I see outdoor recreation is allowed in the C2 district and in the CC district, but what does that mean? If they're using it in its kind of online form, they click on outdoor recreation, that term right there, and they'll get the table. It'll take them to the table that shows all the different land uses that make up that category. There are other ways to handle use categories or that can be useful, like in office right here. Office is another use category. All of them are treated the same on one row except bail bond office. That has some specific standards tied to it, and it's allowed in certain districts that all the other offices are not allowed in. And so that's a way where you can sort of call out kind of an outlier and give where it's allowed, but then say, okay, all the other office uses that make up the office use category are permitted in this pattern and in these different zoning districts. So it can help again with making what can be a lengthy use table a little more compact. So this is the first slide that deals with one of the elements that Heather talked about in the intro about uses by permit being changed over to limited uses. So there are three different kinds of uses in a use table. There's uses by right, which means there's not any special hearing that needs to happen and there's not any real special, standards tied to that use. You know, an office, if we had an office zoning district, then the land use of office would be permitted by right in that district. There's not any special hearing or anything needed to do that. And that would continue. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, there's conditional uses. And those are ones that are higher in impact and can cause, potentially negative impacts on neighbors if they're not mitigated with either buffering or other controls like that. Those have to go to the, I don't recall, they go to you all first for a recommendation, and then they go to city council for final decision. That would not change either. The city council would still have final action and you all would still make recommendations. One thing about that would change is that they would be now in the draft tied to the land, which means, if one person was running a larger group home, as just an example, on a property, and they had gotten conditional use permit approval for it, and it changed ownership, then that conditional use would still remain on that property. As long as they didn't expand it, they'd have to reapply if they expanded it or added parking or did things like that. But if it's just changing ownership, then that approval stays with the land in the draft. Currently, it would not. It would need to be reapplied for. Because in the current regulations, the CUP, conditional use permit, is not tied with the land. So that was one change to conditional use, but in the bigger picture, it's still the same of going to you all and then going to city council. So uses by permit though, they currently go to the Board of Adjustment, and they're also not tied to the land. And there were some times where there were land uses that were supposed to be uses by permit, but they didn't have any accompanying standards with them. So to address this, we have, again, changed the terminology to limited uses. That's just a bit more of a common phrase or term that we see all over. So that's part of it. Thank you. We've also, when there were limited uses or uses by permit that were lacking standards, we put in standards for them. But then we also, instead of having it go to the Board of Adjustment for final action, have recommended that they go to staff for final approval and receive a limited use permit. And that would be based on, very clear standards and articulate standards that are related to each of the limited uses. The staff would review, a submittal, a site plan document, and make sure that, I used the dog park example last night. Dog parks are a limited use. Make sure that the standards that are related to and tied to dog parks, are shown on the plan for development of the dog park. So there are things like fencing, separation from residential uses, trash and waste management, and some other items like that apply specifically to dog parks that they would have to live up to, and that then if they did, then they could get approval by staff. So I think this was the last slide in this module. Oh no, there's one more, or one or two more, but I definitely want to hear your thoughts on this. Well, I guess we could pause now if you have thoughts on this concept.
So right now, the use by permit is not tied to the land, it's tied to the owner of the land. So if they sold it, then the new owner would have to go get their own.
That is correct.
But that would change so that it would be grandfathered, like
Well, as long as so the difference is to complete your first part, right now it's tied to the person or the operator. So if they sold it, regardless of whether anything's changing, they would have to come back and relitigate the whole thing in front
the
of
new owner would.
the new owner. And
Yes.
so what the proposed changes, as long as the operations, the development, whatever the use is, stays the same, you wouldn't have to relitigate it.
Right.
Now,
So
if
then it
it,
would be tied to the land like
Yeah.
the first one.
yes, yeah.
So, sorry.
I'm sorry. I was gonna say, I like this a lot. Yeah, in lots of our sessions, I've wondered, why are we here? Why are they coming back to us? And we all kind of go, yeah, okay, we know you're asking for the same thing that's been done there for a decade, but we have to ask and we have, yeah. So I like this, basically, we also call it like running with the land. I think
Yes,
sometimes
yes,
it's called
tied
that.
to the land running with the land. Yeah.
I don't care for it at all.
Mhm.
I mean, you know, if a single woman shelter is being run by the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth and they sell it to a motorcycle gang, and they might have a different idea of how the single women's shelter will be run. So I don't care for it being sold running with the land. I think the new owner should apply even before closing. That's a contingency upon closing. And I've seen very similar things happen. So I don't care for it running with the land. Also, are they revocable?
Are they what?
Revocable?
Oh, yes,
So, because we've had to do that in the past, where the new owner actually had a very, very poor use of something that they capitalized on. And then the litigation to try and stop that business was difficult.
wondered if there are certain uses that you think would be more prone to needing to be based on the operator or the owner. And I know you just used kind of a somewhat, random example, but to try to have it maybe to where some of the limited uses would relate to the operator. Like I used a group home earlier. I don't know if that is any more prone to mismanagement when they change owners than another use.
Just in my mind, I'm thinking anything that needs a license to run. Daycare center,
Yeah.
group home.
Yeah.
If you need a
That's-
license, that it could run with the land.
But it seems like
If
the
you don't
license is the
need a
appropriate place, though.
license-
Yeah.
Well, but if you don't need a license, then I don't know that it should. But if you need a license to run a group home and it's being run in an area where it's doing it now by permit and you sell it, maybe it still goes because the person who is running that business has to be licensed
Yeah.
to run the business. Now, on the other hand, if you don't need a license to run a boarding house, which and I'm not talking about a tax license or a bit,
Well, business licensing.
if you're not licensed by the state of Colorado as a profession, then that would be different. If a construction, group, that chiropractor. A chiropractor is doing something in an area and has a permit and wants to sell it. The next chiropractor will also have a state license. I think that we can trust the state to be vetting these people. However, it's a business that doesn't really require any oversight. I don't like it running with the land.
Yeah, so that's a good distinction, and I think you flipped it around a little bit there
Did I?
towards the end. But like zoning is about land use and the external effects of land use. It's not about how people practition an occupation. So what I think I heard you say is that if a use is one that requires some sort of state licensure or city licensure, then you would be comfortable with it continuing with the land because there's oversight around the operational and practitioner aspects of the
Yeah.
use. But if it was a use that might not require state licensure, you would be less inclined to have it tied to the land
Correct.
because it might be operated differently.
Correct.
I
That's
think
my-
sort of to go on what Jeff is saying, in your example, you talked about the operation of a business, a shelter run by, I think a Catholic charity was your example versus a biker gang. And I think the point is, this would be talking just about how the land is allowed to be used, just land, not talking about what kind of businesses are
Right.
allowed to be there. That's a separate thing
Right.
that would be handled by different.
But if the
Sections.
land itself, even for the Catholic charity, did not allow for this use and they had a permit for the use.
So the use isn't going to be dictating operation of a business. The use is gonna be dictating, can you have outdoor storage?
Right.
You know, these kinds of things that we're talking about in the code. So that's where I think you need to keep your mind on what types of uses this would be covering.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, like, the way I look at the limited uses and conditional uses. One is how is the land developed? And then there are certain operational aspects, primarily external ones, that need to be regulated in a certain way. So conditional uses are ones where there's too many variables. And it really depends on the context of what's being proposed, where it's located, and the scale of operations. And because there's too many variables, they need to put information in writing and it goes through a public process,
All right.
public hearing. Limited uses are uses that may have external or operational impacts, but we can mitigate them very consistently regardless of location and context. And it's either you meet them or you don't. And that's what we're trying to make here is make the distinction here on the limited use. And so an example I like to give, I know Brian talks about dog parks, and I'm not sure if the code is drafted this way, but they do this in Denver a lot. Outdoor patios associated with restaurants. It's considered a limited accessory use in Denver. And there's design parameters around that to ensure that they don't block sidewalks, and there's permanent barriers around it. And then when it's located right next to a residential use, there's hours of operation limitations on it. And you either meet them or you don't. If you don't meet them, then you don't get the use permit. Or if you do meet them and then you start violating them, then you seek an enforcement action and you revoke that allotment. And so they're a little bit easier to manage because the circumstances are the same across the city. And so that's why like limited uses, it kind of makes, in my mind, a little bit more sense to tie them to the land because there's only so much you can do within that. You either meet it or not. And if you don't meet it, you either are enforced against or your license or whatever the permit is withdrawn. On conditional uses, I'm not sure where I'm going here, but maybe there are some of them that make sense to tie to the land and some of them that don't. And you're trying to articulate a rationale, I think, a little bit.
For
us to-
sometimes not tying
Yeah.
to the land.
Yeah,
So that's kind of, where I'm saying I don't think they should just be tied to.
I wonder if that could be made a decision point. Depending, and that way we don't have to like define it, but like as a condition of approval, the planning commission can recommend to city council and the city council can ultimately adopt a condition that makes it tied to the user, not to the land. And that way they can take that into account on
Be
the
hard to track
use.
over time.
Well, it would be
Hard.
an ordinance or resolution that
Yeah,
we adopt.
and then
away
every
from
time staff was
Yeah.
asked about it, they'd have to go back to that.
Yeah.
ordinance or-
Certainly, definitely something to consider, and that's the point of all this.
Yeah.
We want to consider all your points, but I
And
do just
currently-
kind of want to point out again in his example, he's talking about how there's the hours of operation attached, right? That's not going to be dictating how the business itself is operating, right? So that's going to be something separate. Like they were saying, you're going to have to get a business license or whatever other approvals to operate that part of the business that really dictates what's going on within the building, who's out on the patio, what they're doing out there. That's separate from what this is. This is more just like these little more limited items. And so that might be like, you get to use this patio during these business hours, like as in his example, that could be traveling with the land. But the whole operation of what the people were doing with that patio and with that building doesn't mean that's traveling. Does that
With
make
land.
more sense?
I do understand what you're saying, and I thank you for that. That does make a lot of sense. But currently, right now, none of it travels with the land, correct? So that this would be a change. So if we state the way it's currently being done, that's not traveling with the land. And there's more hands and it takes more time, but there's more oversight.
I hate to restate further, because I know this is gonna be a long meeting. And I agree with you. I think what you're trying to do, now I was thinking of the example here. So the conditional use, the applicant had to go, we gave the applicant the conditional use for that property. So they had to go through and provide us all the things that they wanted to do. And we looked at them and we said, yes, that sounds fine. If that cares of the land, say we go through Republic Trash Service, they know what they're doing and they want to get a dumpster. They want to change it so they can store dumpsters. I saw there's one of them on there, so they can store there. Now that if that carries, I'm assuming Republic would know what they were doing and they would do that appropriately. Now, if we carry that over and somehow some college kids decided they're gonna get in the business of storing dumpsters, they don't have the same business acumen, and I understand it's not a business situation as opposed to that. But now they're running the business of storing dumpsters and they, we should store porta johns here too. Well, that's not part of the conditional use permit, but we didn't give these applicants the conditional use for it. So they don't fully understand it and then have to go through and explain that. Maybe they had that in the upfront and they never explained it to us. So now they're trying to do that, and the enforcement of that's will happen, but that's another step we have to go through now instead of proactively doing things. We're having to retroactively now deal with the aftermath of them carrying over this permit because it was part of the land and not part of the applicant. Is that?
That's exactly what I'm saying as well. So, I mean, that's just an opinion. We're not gonna argue whether it's right or wrong, but that was my opinion, is I don't like it running with the land, or I'm not as comfortable.
Yeah,
That's all.
we took some notes. Just one more thought on, like, does public scrutiny add value to the outcome? That's another way to think about it too. So like, sometimes, and I don't know how the code is currently drafted, but like drive-through restaurants are conditional uses. What difference does it make if it's a McDonald's or a Burger King? The physicality of that improvement, once it's already in place, is in place. You can't really screw that up. And so maybe those are types of things that don't benefit from additional scrutiny when you have a new user in place.
Well, it could be drive-through
Yeah.
called catch and go, where the thing is, you're supposed to drive through and not stop, and they throw you the bag. That's not a McDonald's, but I don't know, maybe
Yeah,
there's some
well,
kind of a
you're never gonna-
TikTok craze.
Yeah, you're never gonna
So,
get
so
over
that's
that.
why
Yeah.
I'm just saying, you know, if we're doing it this way, and if council hasn't complained that they don't want to do it anymore this way, I don't know why we're gonna take it away. All right, enough said, Scott will shut up.
To further that with the public scrutiny, and I was gonna say this is a different point, but to take it away from public scrutiny back to staff, I've seen a number of filings get turned down by the public scrutiny of it. I've been to several of them and just watched it personally live happen. So I don't think that just taking away public scrutiny on majority of things, I understand it adds some red tape to the process, but it's there for a reason, so we don't just blow through things without having any external input to it whatsoever. And it's all kept in a private situation where no one can see what's going on, and then there it is, and we can't change it. Like you said, once you put in a drive-through, it's going to be a drive-through. You can't turn that into a puppy. I can't think of something like that.
Heading to.
Yeah, sure. You can't turn it a petting zoo. It's gonna be a drive-through. So if no one got to see that, even say anything, now maybe it'll go through, maybe it won't, but it gave everyone the opportunity that wanted to speak about it, the ability to say, I don't like this, or yes, I'd love to have this. So I think taking away public scrutiny is concerning to me.
So adds to the transparency.
Yes.
Yes.
So unrelated to this, unless this conversation is
I'm
going,
done.
but taking it a step back, and maybe this isn't a subsequent module, but has there been any discussion to overlay districts tied to character areas within the city?
So I don't believe there are any overlay districts in the draft. And an overlay district is where, you know, there's the base zoning districts, R1, R2, et cetera. But there might be a certain area of the city, like that's a corridor that's prominent, like a gateway or something.
I was thinking like the Derby area. Like there was something about the historic character of that area. It's spelled out in the comprehensive plan that the architecture should be this criteria. But having that, because I know other municipalities like Denver has that in a lot of different areas.
Overlay.
Not to over legislate, but
Yeah.
if there's areas that are important to the character of the city, to the long-term plan of what it should be, should that be something that should be?
Well, we have the Derby review.
But it would be,
Right.
so it's in the review, but it's the character would be outlined.
You can do that in a number of ways. An overlay district is one way, but you could also do it through adopted design standards and guidelines as well.
Yeah.
The concept, it might not be in there, but there's a benefit for it, and like, if nothing would preclude us from adding that in the future.
Sure,
we're gonna
sure.
make it into the first, because there are there are uses for those types of things.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as a whole, we're not absolutely against overlay districts. We do kind of recognize, and I say we, like the firm I'm from, do recognize that it can add like another layer of complexity to a property, where sometimes it's kind of and I know there's due diligence that needs to happen when somebody's getting a property, but it's a kind of a surprise that there's this certain overlay on a property that the buyer didn't know about, or, that kind of thing. It can be sort of, anyway, we tend to try to avoid them, but we've done plenty of, projects that ended up having overlays. This draft currently, though, doesn't have any, basically, to answer your initial question.
I have a question. Right now, the use by permit has to go through the Board of Adjustments for approval, right?
Yes.
So if they change it over, so it's an administrative approval, and then the administration's gonna have like a certain criteria they have to go through in order to be able to approve it. And then what happens to the Board of Adjustment? Do they have other
Yes.
things
They do
that they?
variances. They do variances,
Okay.
yeah. So the use by permits is kind of a different connotation of what Board of Adjustment is usually used for. And it's usually used for appeals to administrative decisions and variances.
And it still would be those two functions.
Right.
Under the proposed, yeah.
So they
They
still
just
have other
wouldn't
things
be
they do.
doing the
They
use
just
by
wouldn't be
permit.
doing the use by permits.
It's an odd function that they currently have.
Yeah, we don't see that very often. This sort of is probably recaps some things that have already been said, but just a view of the use table of a excerpt of it. And, the P means it's permitted, again, L is limited, C is conditional, and the dashes that use is prohibited in that particular district. And there's two, that's why, this one row has dashes for every district, but there's also a residential use table that it would have some P's or L's or C's in it. Still a little bit more with use regulations. We also have standards for accessory uses. So, accessory dwelling units, sheds, pools, stuff like that. Rules for temporary uses, and how long, they can be in place and how many times in a year they can be active, and what districts those temporary uses would be allowed in. There is also wireless communications standards that they were pretty lengthy, if I remember right. We've kind of just cleaned them up and made them more in the style of how we draft and in the style of the rest of the LDC. There are provisions for new and unlisted uses. So we try to think of all the land uses we can and put them in their use categories. But 10 years ago, people wouldn't have thought of like axe throwing lounges or maybe like,
Daycare.
yeah, doggy daycare or cat cafes and stuff like that. So we've built in like flexibility and guidance for the director to, in the future, 5 years from now, when something comes along, an AI, something, who knows, they can use this guidance to interpret, what the most similar use category is for that use and what district or districts it would be in. And if they can't, if there's not a clear, if it's something so different that it can't be really interpreted comfortably, then they could pursue a text amendment to work that new land use, whatever it is, 10 years from now, into the use table, and where it would be allowed, would ultimately be up to the city council after a recommendation from you all. Yes.
So that I know, because it might have not been covered on here, but data centers, where would data centers fall under?
So those are in the use table and allowed in certain districts, and I believe their limited uses were conditional with certain standards. There's 4 different industrial districts, so it would be within, one of those or one or more of those industrial districts. We did have a request, I can't remember if it came from staff or from a stakeholder, I think staff probably. Age restricted retail, that would be like vape shops or other kinds of uses like that where we've put in standards related really to separation, like separating them from each other so that they aren't just kind of clustered together. And so that's in place as well in the use standards, which is a change from what you currently have. Now we're at module 2 and 3, and this was over an hour, and I don't know, how long people have. This was meeting is at least for 2 hours. If we do get giddy with too long of discussion, I could make myself available for a subsequent virtual call-in if you would like. I'll leave that up to staff to determine, but if we get to 2 hours and are still, not through with it, then that could be a decision to make at some point. Oh, so module 2 and 3 are the design standards and the subdivision standards. Article 4, I have a decent amount of content and slides on, not as much for the subdivision standards in this presentation. So design standards, these are again like parking and landscaping and signs and building exterior. We've put in purpose statements for each of the divisions, and divisions are those topics I just mentioned of signs and parking and everything. So what those, why the LDC has standards for those aspects. There is a table that consolidates different development activities and shows when those activities trigger different parts of the article. So for example, if someone makes a minor change to a site, like they add 20% more parking spaces to the property, then there are a limited number of standards that apply to the site compared to if they're entirely redeveloping a site or doing a brand new development on a greenfield, then basically kind of everything applies. So smaller changes, if you're only changing out a sign, then only the sign standards apply, and that sort of just kind of is logical and makes sense. But basically, again, smaller changes equate to less compliance with all the different standards in this article, whereas bigger changes to a site, complete redevelopment equates to compliance with more of the content of the article. And that's to help with, to not disincentivize, kind of smaller properties doing smaller piecemeal improvements over time. If they had got the whole book thrown at them, that might be a disincentive for keeping their property up or modernizing it. There are new building material standards, as well as standards for design of buildings, of non-residential and mixed-use buildings. And then we've also modernized the parking ratios, which is a big topic in zoning and planning work, is making what they call kind of right-sizing parking requirements. A few more bigger picture changes in this article. There is standards for tractor trailer parking and staging. One of our people at our firm is doing some national research on staging. There's some federal laws about drivers needing to get certain amounts of non-driving time. And so there are some standards related to that in loading facilities. Foundation plantings at the base of buildings, landscaping at the base of buildings, tree canopy. There are buffer yards related to parking areas and along streets. There is a thing called the Sustainability Index, which incentivizes more environmentally friendly and sustainable characteristics on a site. And then sort of a repeat from earlier content, some of the amenity space standards. So many of those bullets have content that gets a little more into the weeds here. So we have building material standards, different rules for how much, especially of the lesser, what are thought of as kind of the lesser quality type materials. You can do brick and stone and things like that all day, but then there's more accent materials if it's something like split face or other kinds of those kinds of materials. There's roofing materials that are permitted in this division. And then there's some prohibited building materials that are listed there especially for single family. EIFS and concrete block is in the draft. And then there's some percentages that are allowed of, as I mentioned earlier, sort of corrugated or sheet aluminum and other materials like that. One council member called out vinyl, I believe, last night. I don't see that as listed on here, so we would have to work that in. But that's fairly common to have that as a prohibited material. I'm not sure why we didn't have that in the first place. So this doesn't relate to color necessarily, and doesn't regulate color, or it doesn't regulate any certain style of mid-century modern or craftsman or things like that. It's just like the percentages of the material on a facade. Sort of hand in hand with that is different elements of design to buildings and articulation, and the requirements for those. There are standards related to building orientation, housing type variations. So like some people call that anti-monotony provisions, variations in massing of a building, how much windows are required on a facade or transparency, articulation, which is to do with how a wall bumps out or bumps in and provides visual interest on it, as well as sort of height variations in the vertical aspect. Standards for garages, patios, again, building materials, standards for roof forms. All these different things are laid out without dictating, a certain, again, style or color or that kind of thing.
Appurtenances?
Are you asking if those have standards? So would that be, in my mind, that's like utility related?
Would be elevator overruns, rooftop antennas, things that are sometimes allowed to go above maximum building height, but are needed for building operations.
Well, yeah, well, we have allowances for, as far as like heights, allowances for, there's, a list of building features that kind of have probably been since the beginning of zoning in America, like they say stage towers or stage.
Rooftop equipment, stuff like that.
Yeah, roofing equipment, chimneys, yeah. Those are allowed as far as encroaching, being higher than what would typically be allowed for building height. I'm trying to recall if there's like anything specific about the exterior materials or like screening devices for something like HVAC. I believe there is, but I might have to look on my own time and maybe get that answer back to staff.
Thank you.
For the tractor trailer parking and staging, this was my previous trip here, the council was interested in this and had positive thoughts on it. And it's to require certain industrial uses over a certain size and in certain of the industrial districts to set aside truck staging. So this isn't for when they're loading or unloading, it is for when they're waiting to have their turn at the gate or at the dock. We set out numbers and dimensional requirements. And council at the last time I was here also wanted some minor landscaping there in those areas. That probably needs still further thought. They were pretty set on that, but I don't know if maneuverability becomes an issue if there's like landscape, even if they're pretty far spaced apart, I could foresee potentially causing maneuverability problems if you have some landscape islands out where the truck staging is taking place. It's in the draft right now, but again, probably needs some little further thought. Foundation plantings I mentioned earlier, these are plantings at the base of a building that help to, you know, create a transition between the ground and the building, provides for, you know, pervious surface on the site. There's allowances in there for art or other kinds of things like that to be counted as sort of part of the landscaping, even though it's not, you know, living, growing material. There are, these rules are eased up in the more residential districts to where I believe they don't even apply in the residential districts. It's more geared toward the non-residential districts and buildings. We also, it was brought up recently, you know, a lot of people have fires on their mind, just to do whatever we can to have less, you know, fire chances. You know, there's what's called a plant list in the back of the land development code that lists out different tree and shrub and ground cover species, and shows whether they're appropriate for like right of way on a sidewalk, because the roots can, you know, disrupt the sidewalk. So there's certain species that are appropriate in that context, certain species that are xeriscape friendly, and certain ones that are more fire resistant than others. And so you would have to pick from the fire resistant species on the list as far as the plant foundation plantings. They also in the draft need to be a certain distance, 4 or 5 feet from the base of the building, just to try to make, you know, these kind of strategies a little, you know, do something to try to prevent them more than just having anything goes within the foundation planting area. Tree canopy is another thing that is a change that it's, you know, there's a certain amount of landscaping that's required on a site. But the tree canopy is requirement is there to sort of keep a site from kind of slipping by. I put in quotes that they complied with the letter of the landscaping, but maybe somehow don't have the kind of level of trees that the city would like to see on the site. So different districts have different amounts of tree canopy requirements, ranging from 10 to 20%. And those are based on, you know, either what's there on the site, you know, at the time of development and that's preserved, or based on, you know, this what the newly planted trees would be at maturity and what their canopy would typically be for that particular species. There's also in the draft a tree canopy fund that gets that's established for when it's and there's criteria for what constitutes impractical or impossible to provide a tree adequate tree canopy on a site. Then the applicant can pay into a fund that could then be used for trees plantings elsewhere or in the vicinity of the site.
When we spoke last year, I remember talking to you about calculated based on species and typical crown area at maturity. If a tree doesn't mature until it's 100 years old, I was suggesting that we said based on a tree that is 30 years old, or but not say maturity, because maturity might be way too long.
Okay.
So let's consider changing maturity and making it a more measurable, like a 30-year-old tree, or a tree which has been in situ for 20 years. So
The industry standard is maturity, so, and that does mean what it is, you know, in 20 to 30 years.
we
Doesn't
can
mean
do
the end of
better.
its life.
We can do better than
It
the
doesn't mean the
industry
end of its life
standard.
cycle.
I don't accept industry standard in my line of work, you know, so, because I mean, you know.
I'm just
you're
saying the terminology
yeah.
is what
Required
landscape
to give
architects
a
are used
minimum
to.
of care is what it says in my industry, and I'm not gonna give a minimum of care. But yeah, so I still think it would be better to specify that 20. If that's what industry standard says, why don't we put it in? Okay, sorry, continue.
No,
I have a concern with the cash in lieu of there. How explicit is that? Because that's been abused in the past. I've seen for, not for this obviously, but I've seen it for parks and schools where they find ways to just dump cash so they don't have to deal with anything else. How explicit is it they cannot possibly meet these requirements so that they can actually pay cash in lieu?
Abused as far as it's too widely, the fee in lieu option is too widely used.
It's not my words. That was from a
Or, yeah.
public meeting that I was,
Okay.
but they got turned down because they were trying to do, that was one of the reasons they got turned down, is because they said, you could put this in, we're not gonna allow, for the amount you're trying to offer, so you don't have to do it, it's not acceptable to us. So I just see it there, I'm just concerned, they were trying to get away from that, it seemed like in the past, and I'm concerned putting more options in where it allows for that.
I'd have to open the code to give you that level of detail, so I'll have to make a note to pass that on to staff on some details on that. I couldn't quote you the like what the criteria are for what makes a site, unplantable or unable to maintain the canopy, but I will get that to staff.
It is explicit, I'm just trying to make sure that there is no, it's not wide ranging, there has to be an explicit set of circumstances where these
Yes.
things happen, so therefore we cannot plant.
Right.
Inability to irrigate or such and such.
Or utilities,
Utilities.
underground utilities.
Sure. Or too close to a train track and it's gonna catch on fire. That's a danger.
The sustainability index is another new thing. The E3 department or division has contributed a decent amount to this topic. But we've used it other places as well, and it's seemed to have been well liked. It's a tool for incentivizing sustainable and environmentally friendly characteristics on a site. There are certain exemptions, like smaller developments, or I believe like single family lots are exempted out. But there are, after a certain size of development, then there are a number of points that would have to be achieved through working in different characteristics. And there's a table that, partially that little image is blocking, but it's very lengthy. This is only a very short excerpt of the sustainability table. So you get points by doing certain things, like for an example, just locating in the, that should say MU1 there at that bottom. It says M1, but it should say MU1 district is 0.75 points. Having a blue roof, which is a roof that collects water for use on the site, like for irrigation or something like that, gives 2 points. And so a site would accumulate these points and have to meet the thresholds that you see there as an example for multifamily based on the number of units. For non-residential and mixed use, it's based on the number of square feet. And I think it starts, the minimum is like, I believe 15,000, maybe 20,000 square feet is where you start having to get points. So it's to try to not be overburdensome on smaller developments, but to, once you get into slightly bigger, then those points do come into effect. They're broken up into different, these blue rows here are components. So some of them are related to like stormwater management, some are related to energy efficiency. When a development gets to a certain size and they're required to mix in characteristics from the different components so that there's a variety of sustainable practices on the site. So that's where this stands. Some places we've done it, it's been like sort of optional where they can build up a number of points and then trade those in and get more density or get more building height than what they would have gotten. In this case, there's a bare minimum in the draft, and then if they go beyond it, then they can trade in those points again for like density or height or more impervious surface on a site. So I don't know if there are any thoughts at the moment or questions on.
Is the reason the points are logarithmic instead of linear? So it falls out, your point per unit falls off as it goes higher instead of being linear.
So the 4, 6, 8, and 10?
Yeah, so in the first one, so if you have 10 units and 4 points, it's 0.25
Oh, so
per person as opposed to 0.2 on the 0.02 per point on the 200 units.
So it doesn't, for example.
I'm just saying, as you go higher in units, you'd have to get less points per unit. So it's what it's saying here.
Well, it's just a ratio. they're just preset limits on the different levels of multifamily density.
Oh,
Oh,
We forgot to wave around.
I guess if
You
you
didn't move enough.
you would
Yeah.
you would end up with a huge number of points, I guess, for like 200 or more. I don't know if it would be achievable if you kept going, like if 10 units is 4 points, then 200 units would be, what would it be, 40 points or something like
Like
that?
stacking coupons and you leave with actually all the product and money back.
So, yeah, they're not proportional to the number of units, because I think you would end up with a very high amount of points to require, and I don't know how achievable that would be. Because like the points in the table there are range from like 0.5 of a point to, some of them are 2, you know, like having the blue roof was a 2-pointer.
So then the blue roof has to be for all, or it's not just one blue roof and then 4 others that aren't blue roofs.
It would need to be, yes, the development, would have to meet that.
So that would explain. Okay.
Article 5 is the subdivision standards, and as I said, there's not as many changes, in this, article, as some of the others, and therefore there's, fewer slides on it. Setting out the purpose and applicability of when you have, what the purpose of subdividing is, and what, the applicability is for, different activities that may or may not constitute subdivision of land. Clarifying what we mean by minor and major subdivisions. There's, based on the number of lots and whether, infrastructure is being provided. Generally speaking, there's a kind of a grid street network required in the more dense, districts, the ones that have higher, units per acre, versus, the ability to do more curvilinear streets in the less dense districts. That's accomplished by a connectivity index, where you have to have a certain number of intersections, within a development, to, have more of a grid effect. Standards for, trails are in there, as well as for private facilities and for, the setting up of HOAs, because, you know, I guess, you know, HOA development is probably, I would assume, very much the norm here, but making sure that HOAs are, solvent and are going to stay in place and not deteriorate away over time, and then therefore not, be able to, fulfill their duties. And, you know, we're often asked, you know, how do deed restrictions or covenants relate to the land development code? The staff, you know, doesn't get into enforcing or interpreting or administering or anything with deed restrictions, but you can have some rules for how HOAs need to, be set up and operate. Then we got a lot of input from the city engineer's office on certain things in the subdivision standards, as you would expect, where there's, kind of like, this is the most engineering of the, articles in the land development code. So the subdivision standards apply when a person, in most cases, is dividing or combining, property, you know, into smaller lots, or combining smaller lots into bigger lots. There's some exceptions built in related to state law, that are in there. There are rules in this article for, streets and, you know, street connectivity, like I said, for sidewalk, and trails. And some of this, bleeds over into the, document that the, city engineer maintains. I can't remember the name of it, but the development and design standards, or engineering and design, or engineering standards.
Yeah.
It's this whole separate book that's probably just as long as the land development code, that's related to, infrastructure. The dedication of open and amenity space, utility widths, or, easement widths, and, utility, layout, stormwater management are, dealt with, in the subdivision standards. That's sort of the planning level, not again at the engineering level of, you know, capacity and cubic, you know, feet of retention and detention facilities and stuff like that, but more at the, broader level. Module 4 is the last one, and, the Article 7 is the review procedures is the most substantial of the articles. The rest of them are not a lot has changed in many of them. Here's kind of another view of the contents of Module 4. The review bodies get set up, all the different people that are involved, whether they're elected and appointed officials or staff members that are involved in reviewing and making decisions on applications, the actual procedures themselves, and those are split into a few different categories there. Nonconformities, which are, as I said earlier, either structures or uses or lots, site elements that are set up or that were, complied with the rules at one point, then the rules changed and now they no longer do. So they can continue to exist, but they just can't expand. And some language in there on conversions of nonconformities from nonconforming to conforming. Enforcement and validation or violations is the other piece of this that again is another really legalistic article, but has to do with what constitutes violations, what the city can do to try to get compliance on a site that's violating, and those kind of things. And then word usage, there's definitions, of course, how things are measured, how setbacks are measured, how building heights measured, and rules of construction are what we mean when we say shall versus may, or what we mean by the number of when a review body has to complete review of a submittal in X number of days. We explained that that means calendar days and not work days. So those kind of clarifications are part of the rules of construction. Again, all of these are set up as review bodies in Article 6. Article 7, again, the most substantial one is the review procedures, where we try to look for opportunities to consolidate information. And I think this next slide I'll show will explain that a little better, and getting rid of duplications or inconsistencies, because in a code, the more you duplicate or repeat information, the more likely you could be, just by human nature, inconsistent in wording, so that you might say in one place that the proposal shall comply with the comprehensive plan. In another part of that article, it might say the proposal shall conform to the comprehensive plan. And so there's these little shades of meaning that probably aren't intentionally different, but it's just as a land development code has changed over time by different people who are authoring, different amendments to it. They just have different ways of wording things. So trying to get rid of these repetitions and just consolidate it once and say it once is what we try to do. Having clear criteria for decision makers. If we're going to have more administrative authority and more administrative procedures, then we need to have clearly written, articulate standards and criteria for staff, especially, to hang their hats on, and when they're approving a sign permit or approving a minor modification, that they've got black and white rules to base their decision on of yes or no. Continuing on, one of the main parts, if you're ever looking, at the draft, which we hope you will when it becomes released to you all, there's one table in there in Article 7 that lists out all the different development applications in rows, and in this table, and shows some key information about them. And those columns are in the table there, of course, the application name itself. So I circled conditional use permit as an example, and we'll take that across the row there. Conditional use permit, there is a little cross-reference there underneath it to the actual specific section where conditional use permits are dealt with. The next column is whether a pre-application conference and a neighborhood meeting is required or not. I believe pre-application conferences are optional in the current LDC. This would be more of a requirement that before submitting, that the applicant have a pre-application meeting with staff to kind of run the traps, as they say, and see if there's any kind of thing that the applicant might not have been aware of, that the city has, going on in the area, or vice versa. Also, that column, as I said, has to do with whether a neighborhood meeting is required, and that's something that is new to the land development code, and it would be a chance for the general, or the public who, especially who live in an area where a new development is proposed, that the applicant would be required to do a presentation before submitting, do a presentation, invite, surrounding property owners, basically have a presentation on what they're planning to do on this given site, get feedback. They would have to, take attendance, have a sign-in sheet, take notes, and submit that with their formal application. They could take that information that they get from the neighborhood meeting and make adjustments to the site. If there was an outcry about some kind of screening issue or buffering issue that the neighbors came and spoke against. Well, in order to, work with the neighbors and maybe even have more likelihood of getting approval, they could make modifications to what they thought they were going to do to address those concerns. So that gets submitted with the actual application, the notes from the meeting, and the attendance. No one's compelled to show up, of course, and when I've been on the public side, many times, they couldn't get any neighbors to show up, honestly, but sometimes they really would show up, and it would make a difference in what the applicant was proposing to do. So that's that second column. The next two columns show who makes the recommendation on the request and who takes final action on it. So in the case of the conditional use permit, the director and the development review team review it and give a recommendation in the form of a staff report to you all, and then you all vote, and it goes on. Your recommendation goes on to city council, who has final say. The brackets there around some of the letters mean that a public hearing is involved in that particular application for that particular body that's either making the recommendation or the final action. When there is a public hearing involved, the next column, called public notice, shows what kind of notice is needed. So the P stands for published notice, M stands for mailed notice, and S stands for signs, on the property. And later on in the article, there is the real standards of what we mean by mailed, who has to be mailed to, what the spacing of the signs would need to be, what counts as publication. So it's not just, this table is meant to be like a snapshot sort of what the requirements are. The second to last column is the expiration column. So in this case, for a conditional use permit, if it hasn't been, the process hasn't started to establish that conditional use permit on the ground, then there's a expiration of 180 days in the draft. And once it's going and once it's actually opened, then there's not, an expiration for most of these, but or a rezoning doesn't have an expiration, because a rezoning doesn't expire, even if they never build it, generally speaking. And then finally, that final column is a cross-reference to the standards that relate to that application. So that one for the conditional use permit would point to the conditional use standards. If you click it, it would go to those conditional use standards. Did you have something, Jeff?
I was gonna add to.
Yeah, sorry.
When you're done with this slide.
Okay,
Yeah.
well,
Are you done?
I'm basically done.
I just had a thought, just uses and all of that stuff, and the oil and gas permit triggered a thought.
Mhm.
Has there been any consideration toward micro reactors in the land? Because that's why I was asking about data centers. I know that that's something that's on the horizon, and how that's gonna be dealt with.
I believe the oil and gas regulations were just recently updated a couple of years ago. And the intent right now is just to carry them over. If we want to explore something like that, I think it would be outside of this
Okay,
process, but I'm familiar with what you're talking about, so yeah.
because it's coming, so.
It is an interesting use of waste.
Well,
Yeah.
not wait, but actually having micro reactors, so.
Yeah. That's a good comment. I was gonna say, just to tie a bow on this, is like, for the most part, we're enhancing the public participation through the requirement of neighborhood meetings on certain more impactful applications. Also, planning commission is being proposed to see things like annexations, which you currently don't see, which is unusual. And so providing that recommendation on an annexation to city council, I think, is important. The thing about, and preliminary plats is also a new step that Brian chatted about, and it's, and there's the kind of why behind all this is that there are these earlier applications, so like annexation, rezoning requests, conditional uses. Those are, you're setting rules. You're kind of setting the rules of engagement for how properties are developed. And changing the rules, in some cases, from one zone district to another zone district, those things are impactful public decisions, and they rightfully so are aired publicly, and the community has the right to come and participate in those. The preliminary plat is something that we currently don't have, but it's another allowance that we get. We allow the public and planning commission to have some sort of say on neighborhood design earlier in the process. Right now, that doesn't occur at all. So what happens is planning commission sees a rezoning request, usually associated with an annexation, or a change of zone, and then you never see it again. So this would allow what is the layout of roads and lots and public spaces earlier, and that step is missing from our current code. And it's important that we add that step in because it's a vacuum of public engagement that the current code doesn't allow. In exchange for that, though, the final plat, which is typically just an engineering and survey document, it remains administrative, and it adds a little bit more predictability to the development community that they currently don't have. With the final plat, they're typically doing a lot of final engineering, so they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on something that they don't know they're going to get approved. Council could call it up based upon whatever minor thing or major thing that council wants. And so this is kind of like a acknowledgement that there's an existing hole in the code. We're trying to fill that hole at the right time of development in the development process, where it's easier to make changes, where hundreds of thousands of dollars haven't been spent on final design. And then in exchange for that, allow for the administrative finalization of that design at the final plat stage as well. So it was just something that we chatted about last night a lot with council, and it's meant to bring public engagement early in appropriate circumstances, but also add predictability to the development community and property owners, frankly, who want to develop. It's not all about developers. It could be about you all wanting to expand your homes or do something on your property. So that's kind of the gist and the theme of what we're trying to do here.
In that exchange, is it possible to increase the distance for notification? Because it seems to be between 500 and 2,000 feet from the proposed location. There's a big contentious one right now at 104th that recently happened, and I drive past it within 1 minute of my house, and I'm just outside of the range where they would have notified me. I knew about it because of this, but I'm sure my neighbors had no idea what's going on. It doesn't seem as though the 500 feet or the 2,000 foot, whatever it is, requirement seems to get to enough people that they actually care or notice. We heard a case recently here that only the HOA president and vice president showed up to it.
Yeah, you know what, I had a question about that too at a previous time, because there is a development that's gonna affect our subdivision, but only half the subdivision got the letters because of the 500 feet, and I had suggested that it be increased to like 1,000 feet or
I think it's
1,500
significant if we're gonna start exchanging to these automated completions of the project. I understand, I see the reason behind that, but to get more engagement up front, if we're gonna allow for the end to be automated, if we're gonna really get the engagement, I think we should have to increase the notification requirements to the point that it becomes an engagement process.
The code currently says 300 feet, and we do 500 feet as a matter of practice. So we've already increased it, but doesn't mean we can't go further. Typically when you see more like 1,000 feet, it's because you have large lots, and you would only capture a few lots if you did 500 feet. There is always the word of mouth that happens within the neighborhood where, it gets on Nextdoor or somebody does an email or it gets to the HOA and the HOA board puts it out there. So that kind of informal notification can always occur. And I guess it's just what council's desire is. And, ultimately, they didn't happen to bring it up last night, but it doesn't mean it isn't a point of conversation. We are looking at putting the onus of the mailing onto the applicant. Currently, the city does the mailing. And so that would save the mailing costs from the city if we increase the boundary.
Is this, meeting, are we having no stakeholder input into this at all? Are we just being notified? Because I'll change the way I don't, the things we say, are they being taken into account and possibly
Yeah,
changed, or is it just?
Yeah,
council
we're
saying
taking
that?
notes today.
Okay.
Mhm.
Because I don't want to sit here and waste everybody's time.
Back to the preliminary plat conversation. From previous experience on previous cases, I think that it would be a benefit to the public, but also to the developers at large, because it seems like things are coming in at the 11th hour and it's having to react to things well out of their control. So actually sitting on the architect side of things, I think it would be very pro development as well. So people know what the target they're trying to hit really in the release.
Are there any cons that you have identified to doing it that way? I mean, I like to hear both sides, it just looks like a slam dunk to me, but what would the cons be of?
Well, some communities have final plats go to public hearing, but it kind of almost sets you up for a false expectation because final plats are generally viewed as a non-discretionary land use application. And so if it meets all the criteria and meets the standards, you're supposed to approve it.
Right.
So when city council turns around and turns it down and doesn't have good findings, it just sets you up for the potential for a lawsuit or a false expectation from the development community standpoint about, I met all the standards, but then I got turned down. So I don't think we viewed any negatives. We view the negative right now as you're subject to being called up with your final plat after you've spent lots of money on engineering. And as Jeff said, the preliminary plat is a nice blend because it's earlier on in the process and it engages neighborhoods in a way that they're not currently engaged. And other communities successfully use the preliminary plat.
I do like it, but that's why I was asking, has there been?
It has more process. It does add a step.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
So it
kind
adds,
of the
it
drawback.
adds one
yeah.
step, but it potentially saves a lot of headache for
Yeah.
both the neighborhood, both the developer, the engineer, the city, the council having, so I'm in support of preliminary plats.
So in the past, if council has turned anything down after the fact, have we ever, as a city, ever been sued?
Yeah, we have a lawsuit currently ongoing.
Just one?
Just one. Well, I'm sure there's more. It's just one associated with this type of stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
Moving on, and there's not a whole lot of slides left, so I think I'll just push through if that's okay with everyone. Article 8, development fee provisions, carried over the existing language, except this project started in November 2022. And during the life of it, these pieces were updated independently in 2023. And so those changes that took place in 2023 have been carried over into these, which are different fees that go along with development, whether it contributes to school district or road improvements, drainage, and those type of things. So nonconformities, the biggest change would be the distinction of a major versus a minor nonconformity. That's not currently in the land development code. There would be, and there are in the draft criteria for what constitutes a minor nonconformity. So it's something that has not had, code violations, that is not been changing hands often as far as ownership, and been basically kind of a contributing part of the neighborhood. If it, and there's more criteria than that, but if it lives up to that, then this non-conforming use, which again was like a land use as an example that was established however many, decades ago or whatever, but that complied with the rules at the time it was established, was a permitted use at the time it was established, but as the rules have changed over the years, now is no longer permitted on that particular piece of property or in that particular zoning district. So if a property meets the eligibility to be a minor nonconformity, the property owner can pursue a conditional use permit, which would, go to you all and then ultimately to council to be just kind of deemed in the eyes of the land development code as conforming. And the reason that can matter is it can help with insurance and with let's see, I'm blanking on the other thing. Yes, financing, sorry. Said it last night and I was blanking this time. The nonconformity can be sort of a stigma, I guess you could think of it, on a property when it comes to insurance and financing. And so to have it sort of officially kind of deemed a conforming use or conforming structure as far as the land development code goes can help with, again, with like the with reinvestment on particularly like I think of as like smaller properties, more mom and pop type operations. If it's a major nonconformity, which means it doesn't meet the criteria that makes it a minor one, then it's not eligible for that kind of relief. They would have to do something else. They would either just have to live as a nonconformity or try to change their zoning district or some other things that they could try to do to become conforming. But this is more of a kind of an easier way to achieve just kind of conforming status for these kind of smaller properties.
And is that minor non-conforming conditional use permit, is that administrative?
No, it would follow the steps of a
Is it
normal
of a normal
conditional.
conditional use permit? Okay.
And do you have any, like, just curious, like a major nonconformity is probably a use that is no longer permitted. A major impactful use that is no longer permitted, and we don't want to convert that, but a minor
Yes.
nonconformity might be like your setback is not exactly met, or your lot coverage, you're over on your lot coverage or something like that.
There could be like, I think maybe in terms of like a little like corner store or convenience store, not necessarily fuel sales, but kind of just a little small scale commercial retail use that might happen to be in a residential district, but that has not had any, problems with violations. You could even consider, like police, violations and stuff like that, or calls to the property, and things like that when making a decision on the CUP.
So a small retail store as opposed to like a major oil refinery. Or
Yeah,
something like that. Okay.
Second to last article is enforcements and violations, really just carried over the existing language, might have cleaned it up a little. And then finally, word usage. Rules of construction explain, as I said, what we mean by different terms like shall and may, or and versus or. We say, delegate authority. So we say in the rules of construction that the community development director, when we use that term in the land development code, we also mean the staff of the community development director. So instead of saying the community development director or his or her designee over and over again, we can just use that one position's name, and that includes kind of the umbrella of staff that make up the people that report to Jeff. Rounding is one other thing that of many things that rules of construction handle. And the definitions as well, as was discussed earlier.
Can we talk about master development plan?
Oh, yeah,
fast?
why did I forget that again? Last night I forgot to bring this up too. There's another new procedure that's not in the current LDC called a master development plan. And this would sort of be, preliminary plats are pieces of a larger development. Well, this would be kind of encompassing even a larger development that might have several sets of preliminary plats within it. And it's for, again, larger developments, and there's a certain threshold for what we mean by larger in the code. or mixed-use developments. Because with mixed use, the design is sort of at the forefront of how it's, creating a pedestrian-oriented atmosphere, how the mixing of land uses will kind of feed off of each other, how things are connected to one another within the development. So the master development plan would be a large kind of, you think of it as a map sort of, but with more detail than maybe what you would see in a preliminary plat. There would be kind of areas of different land uses, like if there's an area for townhouses, an area for mixed use buildings, an area for single family detached, open space or amenity space that kind of connects them together. These things would be depicted on the master development plan. We might change the name of that, but to avoid the term master, but some kind of like general or overall development plan. And that ends up going through the process of being reviewed and acted and recommended by you all and ultimately goes to city council. Then the subsequent applications that follow it that relate to, phasing out the different portions of this large development then have to comply with what was approved. It's sort of like the way the final plat needs to comply with the approved preliminary plat. Well, the other applications, the final, the preliminary, the design of the buildings, the land uses have to comply with this overall master development plan that's been approved for the development. It allows, again, this early oversight by the public early on in the process so that when it comes time to something that's less impactful, smaller scale, we might not have as much of an urge to have a public hearing on it because the bigger picture items have been addressed, earlier on. That cover staff
Yes,
and
thank
things
you.
we've kind of talked about.
Yeah, avoiding.
And if there were a bait and switch or an attempt to change something, we would want to set parameters to say, these things are smaller changes that you can make to an approved master development plan that can be staff approved. But if it's anything else besides, tweaking certain things on it, then it has to go through the process again and be reheard and reapproved or denied potentially. Want to make sure that people aren't switching the rules or switching what they're going to do without the right public notification.
That'd be confined to just things that would have to happen during the final process of planning, not things that would be, say, 10-25% of a project. It would be very, very minor. It would be allowable for administratively done.
Yeah, it's usually put in terms of you can't change like the density of the development, you can't change the impervious cover on the site or in the development overall. But if there's changes in shifting, having less parking than what you were originally going to propose, if that ended up happening, that would of course be, most people wouldn't mind that. And so that's a staff, that could be a staff decision or minor shifting of a building, on a parcel, especially if it's a larger one, minor shifting around, just smaller changes that most people are probably not going to notice, once it's built.
So changing a park by 15%, reducing by 15%, that would not fit within the bounds of administratively.
A park?
Open space, whatever you want.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure you weren't saying parking.
Yeah.
In my mind's eye, that would be, reducing it would, by any percent would not be something that staff would be approvable for.
But maybe green space for play park area, swapping it left to right sides is.
Right, exactly. That's a good example too, yeah. We had a slide that had some next steps that, I don't know if Heather, if you want to.
That's fine, yeah, so basically what we're doing this week is we went to council last night with a similar presentation, but we pared it down a bit because of time. And then tomorrow night, we have a public open house. So if there's anybody in your neighborhood that you want to invite to that, that'll be Wednesday in the city council chambers. And then we're going to continue to work on developing a draft, a final draft, well, not a final draft, but a public viewing draft over the next month or so. And then we want to go out to the residents, to the businesses, to the development community, and to our public agency partners like South Adams County Water and Sewer and South Adams County Fire. And we want to get engaged with those entities and with the public on the draft of the code. And that would occur in conjunction and around the time that we go back to Planning Commission and Council in study session. And that would be in April. So April 14th is that date that you would be invited to a council study session to participate. So that public engagement would continue into the spring, and then we would be set up to have public hearing adoptions in June or July. The next step after that is to do the legislative zoning. So we have to rezone this parts of the city to comply with the new zone districts. And so there's a zoning map and outreach that we want to do as part of that legislative zoning to implement the actual code through the zoning. One other concept that has been floated out there is converting some of the existing PUDs to straight zoning. So the PUD would go away in some of the established neighborhoods and be replaced with straight zones. It could also happen for undeveloped property, but there's more conversation that needs to occur with those developers because they have vested interest in their PUD. So there is definitely outreach that we want to do in association with legislative zoning. And that's why that would be kind of a part 2 or a second step in this process. But thanks for all of your time and input tonight. This was a great session, and thank you to Brian for being our presenter. We got through the whole code, so it's pretty impressive.
And it's
to do
just the
that in one
highlights,
night.
believe it or not.
Yeah, just the highlights. I mean, staff's been working with the consultant on this for over a year and a half, so there's a lot of work that goes into it for sure. I wanted to ask you for next week. We do have a public meeting on the car wash PUD amendment that will be coming to you during the regular meeting. But do you feel like we need to have another study session after that to talk about this draft code more? We had that kind of set aside, but I don't know if you feel like you had enough opportunity to have input tonight and you don't need that study session next week.
I'd like time to review this and mull it over. My vote is to have this study session, so I
Okay.
digest this, but I don't want to force everyone else into something.
Okay.
I would just like to be able to read the current new draft of the LEC.
That's what we're getting ready to have it be put out for public review. So only staff, we have a version of it that has all the strike through and cross
Okay.
through, so we don't have a public facing draft yet. But we're working toward that. And then, yes,
And for me, that'll be the most helpful thing to see next.
Yeah,
We'll have
we
a
wanna,
chance.
we wanna get to a point, cause we really can't do any robust engagement at all. It's kind of like at this level right now
Okay.
without a public draft. And so you all rightfully so, well, some of you more than others probably will want to dig into the details and like look at that. And so we're in the process, and it's gonna take a bit of work. We're in the process of refining the draft that we have right now. And making sure that it's good enough to publicly unveil, and then we can start doing this stuff in earnest. And it wouldn't preclude us from having further study sessions too, because the stuff is hard to tackle in a session or two. So there will probably be other opportunities that we present to you all that we want to engage with you to make sure we're.
So the comp plan was 257 pages. How many pages are we expecting for this?
Probably double that if you were to print it. It's hard to say because, it's a name.
There's a lot more
Yeah.
of this. That's what I'm like,
Yeah,
all right,
it's,
so we had
wow.
257 pages and it took a while to go through.
Your current one is, about 500, and when it's kind of counterintuitive, but when you're adding more administrative authority, you're adding more words because you gotta have guidance for the staff to make. And plus, pictures take up space, images, graphics take up space, so.
So sort of back to Heather's question, for Tuesday, you're not gonna have that draft to review yet. So do you still feel like you want a study session on Tuesday or?
Is it possible to have an executive session to review the current situation, the current state it's in, or is that not possible for us?
An executive session would be for me to give you legal advice.
I'm okay either way, but I don't have anything I want to have addressed at this point. So it's unnecessary, but if someone wants it, I'm happy to be there.
I agree, because just the timing of it, we're doing this tonight, that I feel that further in the cadence that that to your point of having future study sessions would be more beneficial and advantageous to us as a group. Because there's not a ton to digest at this time, other than what was just presented to us.
Right. We didn't know how much dialogue we were gonna get tonight, and we had a fair amount of dialogue. So we just kind of reserved that date, but that's why I wanted to ask.
And if anyone wants to watch last night's council meeting, I mean, his presentation to council, they had different questions and different things that they wanted. So if you watch last night's study session, it's perfectly.
If you decide come Tuesday, you want to talk about it more, then we can talk then about setting a date for a special study session, if that's something you feel like you need. There's, with the right notice, there's always that option.
Plus, it'd be helpful, I think, in the future to have, once there's the public feedback and development community feedback, that would be a good time to come back together as well, to have full gamut of input to it.
I think we have
helpful
a
to-
study session tentatively scheduled for the March meeting, right?
Mhm.
So that's always an option to push it to March if you want some more time to just process everything.
And this
What
is,
does the agenda look like Tuesday?
We just have the one.
That's all we have again?
Yeah.
So that,
and this schedule is our target right here. This schedule is our target, and so if it makes sense that we need to adjust this based upon the amount of feedback we're getting through the public engagement process and through planning commission, this is not set in stone. We have to plan ahead to like reserve times, which is why we do this. But we want to make sure that we get this done right.
So at what point would we get the draft?
Yeah, it's a great question. Don't have that answer for you right now. We're gonna be working over the next few weeks to get to that point.
It would be ahead of the April
Yeah,
meeting, and that's the intent.
yeah,
right?
absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. Because we have a lot.
Ahead of, hopefully.
Oh, absolutely, yes, yeah. Yeah, absolutely ahead of it, yeah. We're gonna drop it to you the night before and say, yes, no.
Right.
That
was
caused,
tough.
that was a kerfuffle before.
so I guess we're down to no study session?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
sounds like
I
for
don't
next- for
Things
next
that
month.
I need when, especially without the draft.
Yeah.
I think we should need to wait for the draft, and I think you made a good point, and so we can get feedback from the developers.
Okay, thank you. So I don't think we have anything else for tonight unless anybody has anything else. And thanks again, Brian. That was a marathon session,
No, thank
so we appreciate it.
You know,
Thank you.
tomorrow to come, so.
Yeah, one more time.
One more night.
The open house presentation will be much shorter than this.
Is that something that's gonna be recorded or?
No,
What's the format for tomorrow night?
Yeah.
It's the other room.
The format.
A short version of this presentation and having the poster boards up, and people can put comments on it, and we'll have me or staff members at the poster boards to answer questions.
Well, that's the problem, California. has.
Where's
They
that at?
Made a rule
in the
that
council chambers.
Oh,
every car must be electric. And now they.
Oh, yeah.
I'm trying, my computer's glitching.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I should get a return, it doesn't, and if you returns this big,